for those on the live stream, we're using the microphone in the room rather than the individual microphones, so the sound quality might not be as good as you're used to, but we'll push on. So now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Louise Plodner to say a few words. No, just speak out loud. Yeah, it's the microphone over there that's picking up.
Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to take 2 minutes at the start of the meeting for us to give thanks to water. So if we can, with one mind, give thanks to water. We give thanks to water that cleanses and refreshes us every day. We give thanks to the water that quenches our thirst. We give thanks to the ocean, our first mother. We give thanks to the waters that allow us to grow crops and raise animals. We give thanks to water whose power we know in many forms. We give thanks to the springs and the streams and rivers, to the lakes and ponds and pools. We give thanks to the rains and the snow and the ice. Thank you, waters. Thank you for coming here so long ago and for still being here with us and still giving us your gifts. Thank you. And on behalf of the river, I would like to give thanks to all of you for the work that you do for the river, for the effort that you make, and for the courage that you have personally when you have to rock the boat to make the changes needed to restore the river. May your work for the river be fueled by your love for the river, and may you all be blessed by the waters that sustain your life. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on with the agenda, then apologies for absence. A few apologies. Any?
Chair,
Nick Day.
We have apologies from Nick Day of Friends Lower Wye, some lady from Shropshire, Derby of Forest Dean, although they may try and join later. Richard Tyler for State of the Wye, and some David Gillen is like to join for future meetings, but we tend to support us on this occasion. And also from regular participants at MFI of National Park Corporation.
So the notes documents for the meeting held on the 16th of April included with the agenda pack. Is everyone content that I signed them as a true and accurate record of that meeting? Any objections? Yeah, okay, it's fine. In terms of the question asked at the last meeting about steps NRW taken to reduce the nutrient load in the trolley, Nick Day wishes to follow on by saying, thank you for this response. It is good to see NRW have been active in catchment. Could they advise whether any of the enforcement action was informed by data generated by Friends of the River Wye, citizen scientists, and will they be using such data to target their inspections in the next phase of the project? And has that supplementary been communicated to NRW?
I sent it to
Further response. Okay, that's right.
I don't know if Anne wants to come back.
I don't know. And do you want to come back on that now?
I mean, yeah. So the Trothy team doesn't work under me, but I've passed that on. But what I will say generally is that we're using all sources of data now to help us sort of target our work a little bit better, and focus it on those areas that really need it. So that will include the citizen science data that's coming through from the Friends of the River Wye.
Great, thank you. Fantastic. So that agenda item 3 questions. Number of questions have been submitted from Friends of the River Wye, from Tom Tibbetts, present in the room, Chair of the Friends of the Upper Wye, as published in the agenda supplement 3. And the document also contains responses that were received up till 4:30 yesterday, Tuesday, the 5th of July. And I think there is one outstanding question which related to the role of local planning authorities. The we feel the best way to answer that would be to do it with the other planning authorities who are not present today. So there will be a supplement written response to you covering off that point from all the planning authorities coming together. That's all right.
I very much look forward to hearing it.
Okay. So, thank you very much. We're going to just pause on agenda item number 4 because we're waiting for Alistair to get here, and we will move on to that agenda item as and when he's able to be here and settled in the room. So we will now go to agenda item 5, which is the update from the River Wye Statutory Officers Group. The slide deck has been published in the agenda supplement 1. Thank you very much for that to the Statutory Officers Group and partners. It's much appreciated. And are there any questions arising from that document by any board members to the Statutory Officer Group? Yeah, Mary.
It's more of an observation that it's very difficult to scrutinise documents like this when you get them the day before the meeting. If there's a way of reverting back to a week's notice would be probably better. But lots of these slide pieces have additional links that then have other documents to read within them. And if our job is to scrutinise the document, I find it very difficult not having had a chance to read the document.
Yeah, I think what we struggle with is some of the time frame we get. So we receive the questions on sort of late Thursday, Friday morning, and then we have to provide a response by Tuesday, which is very little time for, as Mary suggested, to provide a
This is the
response.
Statutory Officer Group slide deck.
Not the question.
Other
late
questions.
enough.
Which will
Yeah.
late in.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry.
Acknowledge that and we will try and
sorry.
ensure that it's forward to you.
Because I think that the point is very well made that there are often very good links to
Yeah,
other
no,
documents
well
which are quite detailed, and it would be helpful to have them more in advance.
So it,
Possible.
yeah, it was sent in.
And I realise probably some of the difficulty there is you're waiting for other partners to put their information forward. Probably just say at least a week, and then if anyone hasn't put anything in, that's it.
Yes, and all the gaps and that's.
And some of the graphs, and they probably mean something to people in general, but I don't know what those graphs mean. So if there's a bit of direction on what you want us to look at, that would be really helpful as well.
Yeah.
Good example on page 9, where there's a graph, but there's no commentary on whether that graph shows good, bad, moderate, indifferent. And it's going to be meaningful to the public understanding of what we. I think there needs to be commentary on exactly what they're proposing.
That's the Wye and Lacey Bridge reading.
It's the songs.
Yeah, the song.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
And I think Mary's point that there may be the people who created the graph knows exactly what it means and what it actually tells us, but that's not evident from this document.
Yeah, that's fair feedback. So I'll take that back. We try and balance. I think there's lots of people in the catchment are very scientific, very technical. We try and balance that between the two, but yeah, pointed on that. Just for interest, what it's showing is a correlation between river temperature and cell numbers in terms of algal bloom. So it's showing there's a direct correlation between the two, but yeah, quite rightly, perhaps a bit more detailed explanation would have helped.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's useful because it's about getting best value out of the work that's being
Absolutely.
done as well.
Yeah.
A little bit of narrative can help.
Yeah,
We've got. Yeah, sorry, Tom.
I would echo what Mary said. I think we need more than a day to be able to scrutinise the documents. They're not small documents. And a lot of us are volunteers. And I'd like to know what the right-hand green axis units are in page 9.
Degrees. Degree, the right hand.
So the green axis, right-hand axis.
Chlorophyll. So I thought you meant, yeah, so you've got temperature on the right, chlorophyll on the left.
What are the units?
Oh, what
Are we talking about 10 elephants per square metre or
I'm not going to say that.
square kilometres? Numbers per millilitre?
Yeah.
Micromole
Yeah.
per litre?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Christine?
Hi, thank you, and hello, everybody. I want to say that it's a pity, and I mean, these graphs are an example. I believe NRW has SONS as well, and it's a pity that each statutory agency comes up with little bits of things that we can't kind of compare across the whole catchment. And I'll say it now so I don't interrupt everybody later as well, but NRW has put out a certain amount about the environmental permits for some intensive poultry units, but we've got nothing from the EA or Natural England on what's happening with intensive poultry units in their area. So it's kind of a bit bitty, and it would be nice if we got the same topics across the catchment. Thanks.
Okay, Martin?
And just for context, what we will do is at the end of this, what we call the growing season, between now and September, we will provide, like we've done in previous years, a report, which is providing the narrative around what we found during this season of monitoring, as well as the SON data.
Questions on Mary?
Specifically about the crayfish disease dying off, whatever it's called, because I live in that area. The first slide says about how you can be precautionary regarding spreading the disease, and the second page says it's not likely to be the crayfish plague. Will there be a way of communicating to people that live in that particular area what the outcome is and when they can go back in, but also to the citizen scientists who are testing? So we've obviously suspended testing based on the advice. It would just be good to know when we can resume.
So initially we assumed it was crayfish plague because that's the most common. Actually, in the top of that part of the catchment, we have the Sygnum and white claw that do coexist, which is quite unusual. Consequently, they go off to what we call seed bass, which is the Centre for Environmental, and I forget the rest of the acronym, but effectively they do the testing of looking at what type of virus or pathogen it is. They've ruled out the crayfish plague, and they've ruled out another one called white spot. So at the moment, we don't know what it is. Now, there is a very similar case in Yorkshire, who are further ahead. They had a case, I think it was last year. What we also don't know is, I think at the moment we believe that the population is stable, but what we don't know is whether it's a seasonal variation, so whether it comes in, because normally a crayfish plague, which is wipe out the entire population. So as soon as we know, at the moment we've put signs up, we've contacted the citizen science leads and various partners, the fishery groups, etc. But as soon as we know more, we'll re-communicate back out again.
I have a question regarding slide 17, Natural Resources Wales. And under the recent determination of the environmental permitting regulations business.
We have a separate agenda item for that next.
Well, I just wanted to ask one question, which is, will the manure management plans that have been published for these applications be properly scrutinised for phosphorus content in the proposed spreading?
So shall I come in then to respond to that? So, so I think, you know, the decision that we take now, you know, bearing in mind we do have this later on the agenda. So what we can't do is control the spreading of manures off a site under the environmental permitting regulations. So there will have to be other controls that the spreading of those manures come under. So the planning authorities have been identified as being the key organisation for that. And obviously we've got the control of agri pollution regs as well. So other legislation will kick in beyond the boundary of that permitted site. the environmental permitting regulations can only control stuff within the footprint of the site that's actually covered by that environmental permit.
Yes, I'm well aware of that, but these manure management plans do cover the spreading of manure within the permitted site. And my question is, rather than just only looking at nitrogen, will phosphorus also be properly taken into account?
So, yeah, I mean, you know, whether it's phosphorus or nitrogen, if it's a nutrient, then yes, that will be taken into account under a manure management plan. It isn't only just phosphorus, you know, so it's about nutrients rather than just P.
Councillor Charlton?
Yeah, I'm sorry to go on about this point. I know you do have an agenda item with your press release on the next part of the agenda, but I think there is some concern as a local authority member here that just saying it will be the planning authority that would check up on manure that is outside the site. I don't know whether planning authorities have got the right professional qualifications to measure what will happen if manure has come off site. So I'm just asking the question really. NRW are set up for environmental enforcement. I'm not sure, unless somebody can give me a different answer, how a planning authority is actually set up to deliver that side of it, because that's one of the big issues that we have with the poultry units. And as you will see, the 3 poultry units that are about to go through here are in Powys. And they do impact on the Wye and surrounding area. So if they take the manure off site, I'm just really worried that we're going to have the same problem, but somewhere else they're just moving it on, and there's not really a clear way of actually policing that. That's the only word I can think of, really. So I don't know how you feel on that one from NRW. It kind of feels like you can do your bit and then you're just handing a bit over to somebody else to do, and I'm not sure they're set up to actually police that. I think that's my concern.
Okay, so to the manure that those intensive poultry units generate, we cannot legally do that under environmental permitting regs. And I think so we put this pause in place while we had a bit of a look and a bit of a think about that. We have a statutory requirement to determine an environmental permit within a certain amount of time, and on these permits we have well exceeded that whilst we took this time to undertake this review. We can't legally justify non-determination of those permits any longer, and there has been some recent case law which has kind of reinforced that position. So we are legally obliged to determine those permits. So nothing has changed. We were looking to see whether we could do something additional through EPR. Okay. So we're not stopping doing something that we were previously doing. We were looking if there was a way through EPR to actually manage that risk a little bit better. There isn't, and we can't. So we have to go back to doing what we, you know, the status quo remains basically. So if that helps.
Well, it explains the situation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help.
No, I get that. Don't worry.
Yeah. No, okay. Thank you very much for that explanation, because
Okay.
I couldn't pull that out. I mean, you can see, you can read between the lines, but I'm not professionally qualified to read really intensely between those lines to understand it. I understand better now. So basically, we're in exactly the same position as we were before, and the moratorium that's on is off now, and we've just got to get on with it, really, I suppose. Okay, I'll take that back to my local authority.
There is still a pause with determining planning applications with Welsh Government. So, and these sites not only will require an environmental permit, they will also require a planning permission for expansion or any change. So just because the decision around the environmental permit can proceed, there is still the planning matter. And that's still, you know, there was a holding direction issued by Welsh Government some time ago, and that holding direction is still in place. So there is still the planning side, which has not been resolved, and that's still sitting with Welsh Gov.
Okay, but now you're offering permits. There's very little to hold them back as well now, I'm assuming.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you, Alyssa, thank you, thank you, Anne.
So Andrew McRobb and then Christine Hugh-Jones.
I would just like to add one point here. This is not an NRW Wales issue because we are all aware that water has no boundaries. So if we have more pollution going into the upper reaches, it will come into Herefordshire. And I think that I take Councillor Charlton's point that I don't think any local authority is equipped with expertise or resources to manage to the degree we would like to see manure plans. So I think we have to take this as a singular problem for the whole of the Wye Catchment.
Right.
I've got a question, if I may, and which is how does NRW discharge its duty under the habitats regulations to ascertain that the project will not have an adverse impact on the SAC? There's not a question of whether or not NRW can control the impacts. It can't be certain that the local planning authorities will be competent to manage the manure issue. So just in the sort of similar way that LPAs can't rely on the EA, you can't sort of outsource responsibility where the HABS regs are concerned. So how do you square that? How does that work?
So there would have to be a HABS risk assessment for any permit that we issued. So before issuing any permit, there would have to be an HRA, and that would take into effect, you know, the impacts from within the curtilage of that permitted sites. And you know, all I'm doing really is passing on a decision that's been taken by the organisation. You know, it's you know, we feel that the legal advice that we've had is that we cannot hold off from determining these permits. So there will be an HRA that's done for the environmental permit within the curtilage of that permitted facility, and then beyond that site, we would be looking for controls through the planning regime and any HRA that would be associated with the planning regime.
Christine.
Yes, as far as I'm aware, I mean, Anne has mentioned the curtilage of the site. I think it's just the footprint of the installation that the environmental permit applies to. I might be wrong. So that would just be the shed and maybe the free range if it's free range chickens, but not the fields around that the manure might be spread on. And I don't believe manure management plans are part of the permit sort of seeking operation. The other thing is that I wanted to ask is when the LPA comes to deal with it, then NRW is the statutory consultee that they very much rely on, not having their own expertise, except sometimes the expertise of their environmental officer. And so, in fact, it still comes down to Natural Resources Wales to say whether it ought to get through planning in reality, because although the planning authority is not obliged to listen to what NRW says, in a court of law, if it has listened, that's usually sufficient. So, you know, it's NRW with another hat on, because under that hat it is responsible for designated sites and should have to look at, and some of the statements NRW's made recently have found that it can't really properly take into account what happens to the manure afterwards. So when Clanchet Lane and the two others come before the planning committee, what will NRW do? Will it still say we can't really be responsible for what happens to the manure afterwards, so we don't really know what to say, which is the case with all the cases that currently have holding directions. I think there are 12 at the moment with the Welsh Government. And the other point I'd like to make is we're saying all this about these planning applications in Wales. There are poultry sites going through planning in Herefordshire and we're not talking about them.
Shall I just come back briefly on one of those points, Christine, that you've just raised? So yeah, as a statutory consultee, we would issue advice to the planning authority, and that advice might include advice on spreading that manure and any controls that we would want to see around spreading that manure. So, so if we are now expecting local planning authorities to include conditions in planning permissions around the spreading of manure, then we would be advising through the statutory consultee process on that advice. We would be providing advice to the planning authority about that.
But the latest statements that NRW have made that statutory consultee reports for everybody to see on the Powys website suggest that you can't. I mean, that's where everything's stuck. That NRW can't actually say that the manure won't damage designated sites because it has no control over the future path of manure once it leaves the farm.
Site. Okay, it's a catch-22, and and I think whether this position statement now changes some of the advice that we issue to planning authorities or not. This was a very kind of hot off the press issue. We went public with it on Thursday last week, so it may be that we review some of the responses that we now make through the planning consultation process.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think it's important, actually, it's an important point to end on, which is that this is a consultation. So, if anyone's got something to say about where this is, this is the point at which you respond to the consultation and raise any concerns that you might have, or ways in which you feel that this may or may not be aligning with HABS regs and other case law. Okay, so anyone got anything else on that? In which case, we will see, Louise.
Just trying to understand it really. That the legal team has used case law to say that manure spread on site can't be considered through the permitting system. The permitting system is part of what's relied on to protect the river. But the permits can't protect the river if they don't deal with all the manure off site as well as on the holding itself. So what would it take to change the permitting system to bring it into alignment with supporting the local authority to make the planning decisions? And the statutory duties of obviously NRW and the EA to protect the river, because we're permitting, proposing to permit development and expansion of the industries that are harming the river without a solution or a body able to control the spreading of manure. Surely, even on a precautionary principle, we shouldn't be permitting more until we can find an area that has the soils tested and can be proven to meet the spreading of that waste on it, which we know don't exist in the Wye Catchment with our excesses of, 1.86 tonnes per hectare. How can permits go ahead in their current state? Surely we need to change that system in order to make it function. I appreciate it's not in your power to do that.
Is that a question for me? Sorry.
Push that forward.
And
create some changes to promote that system as not viable, not fit for purpose, not able to do its job.
So the environmental permitting regulations are England and Wales, and any changes to those would it would be a sort of legislative change, which would take time. But at the moment, we cannot use EPR to control off-site manures. We have to use those other things that are available to us to manage those manures. That's the planning process, that's the agricultural regulations that we have both in England and in Wales, which do vary slightly, but with the same sort of basic kind of principles. So there are other means of controlling manures that are going on land off site from a permitted facility. We just can't use the environmental permitting regime to control those manures off site. So there, this doesn't mean to say that there are no controls. It just means we cannot control them through EPR.
Controls must be failing, or else we wouldn't have this excess of 300,000, 300 tonnes. You know, the current controls are obviously not enough and obviously not working well enough. And I know there's a lot of people working to improve them. Surely starting as a community, we shouldn't expand the industry that's doing harm before we've dealt with the existing problem.
Yeah.
So that's a very pertinent question. It's not something I think that Anne can reasonably be expected to answer, but I think it's a fair challenge.
Is that something the board?
So
would
it's
like
the
to see
50th issue.
though?
Which is, you know, how do if we haven't got a solution for it, how do we add to it?
Chair, is a representative from Paris Council here?
Yeah, she's on the call. Charlton.
In which case, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Because I've sat in this meeting or these meetings long enough to remember asking Peter Morris, who was at one point representing Paris, about the cumulative impact assessment of manure management and manure spreading. And his answer to me verbally was that by dint of the fact that the environment permit regulations were assessed on their behalf by NRW and came back with a big green tick, he therefore assumed or deduced that everything was fine with the application and no further concern over manure spreading needed to be taken. Has Paris's view on this matter now changed?
At the Charlton.
I'm happy to come back on that. I'm not quite sure who is talking then because we can't see online who's talking if they're in the room. But just to say, we do have an officer in this meeting who is taking copious notes at the moment. Some of you may be aware, but Peter Morris was taken seriously ill some months ago. We're not expecting him to come back to work. So he's not here to respond to that, I'm afraid. But I've been having a conversation with the officer in the background, and we will be taking this back to see what the implications are. So hopefully we'll have something for you either through the chair to give you some feedback, or at the next available meeting so that you've got that information. But I'm sorry, I can't answer your question.
Thank you, Councillor Charlton.
Fair enough. Okay. So I'm now going to reverse a little bit. All right, with Alistair. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And welcome to the meeting, Alistair Wager, who's the Deputy Director of the Nature Restoration Fund for Natural England. Welcome, Alistair. Thanks so much for being here. It's quite an epic journey for you, and we do appreciate you being in the meeting. So really, we're looking to you for an update on the Nature Restoration Fund and how you think that's going to work in this catchment, and what can we do to make sure that it lands well and is successful and delivers what we need to see it deliver.
Yes, absolutely, and thank you. And I guess, obviously, conscious that this is a new emerging kind of field of policy, so I can give a brief overview of what the Nature Restoration Fund is, because I'm conscious it can be quite complicated. You might recognise me because I'm on to comment now from MHCLG to Natural England to help with the implementation of this. And when I was in MHCLG, I helped with the drafting of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. That's been introduced to Parliament. That's currently at the House of Lords stage for consideration, so it's progressing. And that contains this new proposal of the Nature Restoration Fund as a more strategic way of dealing with environmental obligations. That includes for protected sites and for protected species. So that includes habitat sites and European sites. But it's very focused in its scope there, because there's a recognition that there are lots of environmental issues and not all of them can be dealt with in a more strategic way. It contains this concept of an environmental delivery plan. So that is a plan that's drafted and prepared by Natural England. It's consulted upon. It takes into account local kind of plans and things. So the local development plan, also a local nature recovery strategy, and then the environmental improvement plan, which is the national plan, as it were. It is focused on specific issues. So in this context, it would be something like nutrients pollution adversely affecting a habitat site. And then it allows for Natural England to consider what is the evidential baseline of the problem, what is the amount of development that may come forward over the plan period, what are the environmental impacts of that, or the negative effects for a specific issue, such as phosphorus pollution. what are the conservation measures, so the interventions in nature that's needed to offset and outweigh those negative effects? What do they cost in aggregate? And then how can that be apportioned to a levy mechanism so that development can be enabled by paying a levy rather than seeking to deliver mitigation of a piecemeal approach, and by doing so secure not just neutrality but a positive contribution towards nature restoration. That's not to say that development must pay for all of restoration, but saying by having a more streamlined process for development that removes the need for project level assessment, the kind of delays and uncertainty that can cause, and moving to a more certain approach that has, where the state in effect is taking on more responsibility there, the quid pro quo is that there is contribution towards restoration. There are then lots of enabling provisions around that. Some of those are more controversial than others, but they're there to make sure that Natural England has the necessary powers and tools available to be able to deliver conservation measures. That's not to say that Natural England is looking to ride in and say, we will deliver everything and there will be a whole team of people here from Natural England doing things in an area. Rather that there'll be partnership working with lots of stakeholders in areas that are covered by this. There may be more strategic interventions where Natural England take a leading role. There will be lots of areas where local authorities have been involved because we're looking to build on the existing work that's happened through the local nutrient mitigation fund. So it's about building on the existing delivery of mitigation measures, expediting and having a forward-looking plan to help deliver those. Obviously, this is still subject to parliamentary scrutiny, and you'll appreciate that there's lots of debate at the moment around that, so I won't look to get drawn into that side of things. However, for the measures to come forward and for a plan to be made, there'll need to be some secondary legislation. So the bill will need to progress through Parliament. What the timescales will be for that exactly, it's all subject to parliamentarians. There'll need to be secondary regulations, and then Natural England will need to notify the Secretary that it's intending to prepare an EDP and then do the work to prepare that EDP and bring it forward. There's then this, as I say, 28-day consultation on the delivery plan with engagement beforehand, and then it's made. Once it's made, there'll then be the ability for developers to utilise that, and then Natural England has up until the EDP end date to deliver those conservation measures. What does that mean for somewhere like Herefordshire and the River Wye and River Lug? So I guess you'll appreciate that there's the government's manifesto commitment to deliver solutions to unlock housing delivery from nutrient neutrality. So Natural England very much expects that EDPs for nutrients pollution will be some of the first ones that are brought forward. There aren't decisions at the stage of which one will be the absolute first one, whether there will be all at once, as it were. There are some kind of just slightly boring procedural things to figure out there of does Natural England have the capacity to consult on lots of plans at once to face those slightly different things, but that will take a little bit of time to work through some of those practicalities. What I can say is that Natural England's forward leaning in this, and whilst the bill is still progressing through Parliament, we're now stepping up the work to consider what does an environmental delivery plan practically look like rather than just a legislative concept, and then how can we engage with both stakeholders kind of conceptually on what needs to go into a plan to make sure that it's robust and people have confidence in it, but also engage at a more local level on how we put in place the right delivery mechanism, and we make sure we're engaging with local partnerships and the like, such as this board here, so that we can really look to maximise the benefits that through this approach. So whilst the plan will focus on a specific issue, such as nutrient pollution, by having that more strategic approach and ability to look more holistically at what needs to happen, you can then start to say what are the secondary benefits that we can bring forward. Can we do things that also, deliver natural flood risk management? Can we also do things that increase public access to nature? And then how can we build that in so communities also recognise the benefits that development is paying for, so that this isn't just something that happens in potentially. Conscious I've covered lots of ground there and it can potentially be complicated. Very happy to answer questions at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I would just draw your attention to, you're probably well aware, but the question mark for me would be, one of the question marks, I suppose, I've got loads of questions, is the lens. So what you know, if you're saying we're going to do strategic mitigation, but you know, what's the lens that says we're going to do this there and that there, but not that there and that there? I would assume that that's going to really use the local nature recovery strategy, the nutrient management plan, the catchment management plans, you know, bring them together, all that knowledge, and that's the lens to say, these are the places where we think strategic mitigation will be most sensibly, but where there's stackable benefits that you identify, plus community benefit, which I think is a really important thing to align those, the legs of the stool of sustainability. So that's roughly.
Roughly, yeah. So we're still developing this at the moment, but what we're looking at is kind of opportunity modelling. So how can we enable the best strategic assessment for specific issues, and by doing so, feed in all of the data and information from the local plan, from the local FRS, from the kind of experience that has been built up of existing issues and things, and the existing schemes of work that has been put in place. All of those previous kind of consultants' reports and evidence gathering, I think, should be fed into that consideration, so that then when the opportunity mapping is done, it has lots of factors.
So it all makes sense. It all suddenly comes together.
Exactly.
So just to clarify for those who are not here, this is England, not England and Wales. And you're talking about mitigation, hopefully kind of primarily nutrient neutrality, where that's already an issue, so within the Wye Catchment, but then potentially it will fold in the local plan out 20 years out.
Yeah, so the focus will be on the local, because that's why the neutrality advice is in looking at the local plan. So EDPs will be capacity focused, so it'll be saying over this 10-year plan period, what is the housing demand or local housing need that we're likely to expect, given the government's commitment to 5 million homes. So that can then be factored in. There's then a question of granularity of how closely do we need to know where exactly the house is going to go. But if there are site allocations, like that will be useful information to feed into the considerations, because we'll want to have that kind of sub-catchment understanding where possible to understand where the demand is likely to be. Then the EDP will set a maximum capacity, say 10,000 houses or something. Then when a planning application comes in, you kind of check what on the list, as it were. So we'll want to make sure that the capacity is high as possible, noting that then environmental constraints and environmental factors may then necessarily limit that potentially, because if we don't have the confidence that we can find enough conservation measures, then we won't be able to bring forward a plan for that. That's a matter of development. It's not unwanted and out of it. So that's why it's starting with what's needed for local housing, even 1.5 million homes, considering those environmental factors to see if that is achievable and get those conservation measures, and then reducing it if necessary. Obviously, naturally wants to support the government's group ambitions here, whilst protecting nature. So the ambition is high in the regard.
Andrew.
Hi, Melissa. As part of CPRE, we are feeding into the consultation that the government's now going through. Could you just let me know, and perhaps people here, is the plan going to supersede or run alongside CIL and 106 contributions, or is it going to be a new initiative for bigger, bolder developments? Because certainly I think that from my personal perspective, I'd love to see EDP having a much more structural position, so that we knew that whatever funding is coming in gets used strategically in the best possible way, rather than, not that I would suggest Herefordshire do, it gets stuck in an account somewhere and maybe doesn't get used. So I'd just be curious to see.
So the plan has the levy mechanism, which then sits separately. So you've got section 106 and CIL as ways of development contribution being gathered. What it has is what will be the nature restoration levy regulations, and that will be a new approach for collecting the contributions from developers, specifically environmental delivery plans. That money will then most likely, and this is set down in the explanatory notes of the bill, collected from town and country planning development via a planning condition that says before the development starts, the levy contribution must be paid in full, or instalments paid with Natural England. that's intended to remove some of the legal work that's needed around Section 106 agreements and things. So it's a more streamlined process. But when that money's collected, it's then ring-fenced for that specific environmental delivery plan. So then the money must be spent on that environmental issue in that place, as it were. How the money is then spent is, a question, because naturally we'll have powers to, spend the money directly itself, do compulsory purchase if needed. It's not the go-to tool, as it were, because there's a lot of work there, and there's lots of negotiations that would happen first. But then also give money to local authorities, work in partnership with, private mitigation providers, but also work with, if developers have land holdings that have the right opportunities and things, there's options to work there potentially. But the approach will sit alongside those existing kind of legal agreements.
So to respond to Andrew's point, so Section 106 SIL and BNG, they're all in addition to the Nature Recovery Fund, which I think is something that the public haven't quite grasped. They think it's instead of. So I think it's important to say developers will be expected to pay for the things they already pay for, plus 2 sets of new things. As somebody without a developer hat on, somebody that lives in the Lurg, or used to work in the Lurg, I'm a bit concerned that the Nature Recovery Fund, probably by the name of it itself, is misleading people to the idea that housing can pay for the recovery of the catchment. There's a huge difference between what we need to do in the catchment to restore favourable conditions and what developers could ever pay for under the terms of the number of houses that will be provided, as much as the viability of housing in Herefordshire. So I wonder if the name is misleading, because technically it's a strategic mitigation fund, which luckily for Herefordshire, we already have expertise of delivering strategic mitigation, not 100% successfully, but it has learning elements to it. I know you'll be aware of the wetlands and how they can maybe be taken forward. But with my developer hat on, I have a couple of concerns. First of all, I'd rather the catchment was fixed. So I think we all need to remain focused on the fact that we have a polluted catchment. We must fix that. And once that is fixed, there should be no requirement for developers like myself to pay for the pollution of other sectors. Can you confirm that it's just housing that you're seeking the mitigation levies from, not from other developers, whether that be industry, agriculture? There are other types of development, but all the roundtables I've been in, it only refers to housing, which I think is a huge worry when you know that the impact from housing is tiny/negligible. Timescales are a worry. While Herefordshire Council have a pot of money for mitigation given by developers already, while they have another option kind of bubbling away in the background, it's very difficult for them to commit to their strategic proposals going forward. But likewise, for somebody that provides private mitigation, it's really difficult for me to go and argue that I want to invest money on a scheme, knowing that there might be something coming along. Do you have any idea of timescales for the EDPs or for when levies will start being paid?
So that's all subject to progress of the bill through Parliament, and that's a challenge, and then you need the secondary regulations to follow. Obviously, it's an important government priority. You've heard the Prime Minister and the Chancellor talking about this a lot, so Natural England is working as quickly as possible to do so. I think the thing following on from there is around, we're considering more of the transitional arrangements. How can we look to build on the success and the work that's already happening in terms of mitigation? Because the last thing that we would want is for people to be delivering mitigation like with a local nature mitigation company, and you are through private schemes, then for there to be a gap, and then all the delivery to stop, and then for it to come along and say, good news, we now need to do 10 times more and things. That's just not what we want to do. So I think we need to be, and that's why it's important I come saying things, to start to have those conversations. How can we start to have early discussions so people know what's coming down the line? What are we looking for in terms of conservation measures? Not least because conservation measures and what's already happening in the mitigation, as it were, will look largely the same, probably. So it's about setting those kind of standards of what we expect and things, so everyone has a clear understanding of that sort of things.
I think a transition document would be really useful, because Herefordshire Council have about 5 kilograms left from the wetland. So you're back to the point of standstill again, which over 5 years has been really drip, and now we're back to standstill, but also the catchment declines while we stand still. Transition document would be good.
I think then taking your second point of what development is in scope of EDPs. So it's for Natural England to specify when preparing EDP what development is in scope. it's very broad there in terms of it can be housing, it can be anything, it could be nationally significant infrastructure projects. So there's a question of considering what's appropriate there. We're still working through that process, but as you heard from the Chief Executive of the Environmental Audit Committee in Parliament a couple of weeks ago, naturally he's approaching this through the lens of the environmental principles. So there are questions there around what should be in scope, because there are choices in terms of should a major point source of pollution be included in this. For example, something like if you're building a wastewater treatment works, presumably it's better that goes through the normal conservation route and then doesn't utilise the levy mechanism, because we want the pollution to be addressed at source in that way. And doing so could skew an environmental delivery plan. You could have so much, actually, the measures need to go on one thing. There's not very much left for other things. But that's being said, we want to enable as much sustainable development as possible. So we might not want to say this is only housing, because then we rule out prisons or campsites and things. So other things that we would want to come forward.
Is there a prison coming for Hereford?
Not saying that, but it is in the government's 10-year prison strategy. Does reference an interest rate, which came to mind. More generally.
That would be a big idea for council, yeah.
But then there's then lots of difficulties, I guess, around that as well. Of how do you create a simple process that provides clarity for people, and that streamlining, whilst including as much development as is sensible and possible, is something that National Government's working through at the moment. And then your first question, sorry, was around not wanting EDP to be for their forever, as it were, wanting to fix the site. So I think there's a couple of points on that. So the levy mechanism will in almost all cases be optional. So there will then be a choice for developers coming forward. When submitting a planning application, does the application go through the normal habitat regulation assessment route and potentially nutrient neutrality and kind of that avenue, as it were, to demonstrate that there's no adverse effects, or does it go through DVP? If you then get to a situation where site is recovered and everyone can celebrate in that regard, then the development would have the choice of not going to DVP, because it could say, I've done my assessment, it's not going to have an adverse effect on habitat site, therefore I can just demonstrate that in the normal terms, as it were. So that's ultimately the place where I think everyone wants to get.
Right. So there's a couple of things that I've got it on, so I forget. One is that when we talk about the site being recovered or whatever, we need to start to be really, really consistent about what we're referring to, because that doesn't necessarily simply mean that the phosphate levels have come within target. So you might have wonderful phosphate levels, but you might still have a problem with your white-clawed crayfish. There's no amount of housing appearing or not appearing going to make any difference to the white-clawed crayfish. So I think we cannot set a target for housing to get a catchment to favourable conservation status, when in fact a great deal of that's got absolutely nothing to do with housing at all.
Yes, right. It should be more
so if it is simply within a nutrient target, yes, then that's a separate thing. And then I think the point that Mary was making, which is fair enough, about fair share, which is when you have achieved fair share, then what happens? You're still expecting housing to make a contribution to offset nutrients coming in from another source. That's a kind of conundrum for me, and I think it would seem to be basically against natural justice at any degree of fairness to expect one sector to pay for another sector's emissions. And that also then relates to the point that Mary was talking about, what does constitute a development, and that always in my mind, I wonder if actually what we talk about development, we should triangulate that with plans and projects. So what is a plan and a project within the catchment as far as Hatterex is concerned, and rather than a development, because development without rule out permitted development, for instance, is that within or without the scope? And if it's a permitted development which is going to wind up with a nutrient increase, surely that should be within scope, even if it's a permitted development.
Yes. So I guess the lens to look at it through is the habitat regulation assessment applies to all plans and projects. If you're bringing forward a project that potentially has a likely significant event and you need to show there's no adverse effects, this is then an option for projects which need to go through the planning regime, as it were. So part 3 of the Town and Country Planning Act, including permitted development, to be able to go through these. So
They would
environmental
apply where
permitting,
house regs would apply.
yes, so environmental permitting is encompassed by plans, but if it's something that's under development rights, then that could be scope.
A follow-up question as well, which is specifically for the lug, in that we're a tiny catchment, but arguably some of the reasons why we have some pressures are because we are generating products that are enjoyed by the nation, but you're expecting another sector, which is a very tiny amount, to contribute to mitigation. I wonder whether we're just looking at it in the wrong way, that we need to look at why we have the problem and who should be contributing to the recovery of that. In your new job, Alice, I'm hoping that maybe those are the kind of conversations that you can't really fix a problem that's so in a really tiny geographical area when the reasons for that problem are actually vast. And I think we need to look at why are we holding the lug to this kind of untenable pressure and kind of discontent when we know that we can't fix it through the Nature Recovery Fund anyway. I just worry that we're kind of looking at, we've got a new option. We have the wetlands. I hope that your team will be able to write to Herefordshire Council to say carry on with other projects you've got in place, and that you give private mitigators also the confidence to say keep going, is what you're describing. I think it's a couple of years away, I'm guessing. But also we need to broaden out as why is the lug under this kind of problem, and is this going to fix it? It's like a tiny pin drop into the following bar.
And I think it's the point of recognising what can be.
Yeah.
Both in terms of considering in terms of restoring things, what issues can it deal with and they can't deal with.
Can that developers actually contribute, because it's painful at the moment, it's going to get worse, but I can't fix the problem. It's not £4 million went into the wetlands, save 40 kilograms. You know, it's a sort of madness that we're still in this. I'm hoping that the breath of fresh air kind of a new perspective to it.
And there's some debates here to be had more widely, I think.
I'm very happy to keep debating this.
Yeah. What about your plans for yeah.
I was just going to jump in on the comment that the council's strategic mitigation. So, I mean, we're not stopping what we're doing, waiting for this. We've had conversations in terms of we continue to look at the transition. We continue to have that conversation going forward. So, I think just to reassure you, it's not we're looking to that.
Yeah.
We're going to stop. That's not where we are. We're looking to phase 3. How do we develop phase 4? Because we need to be doing that.
With phase 2, then if you want to do phase 2,
we're in phase
I know you're saying you're kind of rolling it forward.
We've done 1.
Yeah.
We're into
Keeping.
We're looking to start 3. We're planning ahead for 4.
Yeah.
We'll continue to do that cycle, and we'll be able to.
Right, so anyone got any other comments or questions for us there? No? Only remains for me to say thank you so much for coming here and telling us about the nature restoration.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Agenda item 6, the Diffuse Water Pollution Plan Progress Report with update from Market Environment Agency. It's in agenda supplement 2.
Yeah, so I think previously we've spoken about where the diffuse water pollution plan came from and why we're producing them now. It was a judicial review in 2015. We've also said that they're jointly owned between us and Natural England, but the Environment Agency is leading the diffuse water pollution plan for the Wye. Now, I'm fully aware that sharing part of the report is perhaps not helpful to many people in terms of just seeing a snippet without the wider context. There is the report we're still drafting that sits behind this, which explains some of the work we've gone through. It updates some of the measures, the targets, the modelling, and provides a narrative around some of the decision making. Now, the reason why I shared this section, because I think it would be helpful just to share something, mindful that if I came here today and gave you a couple of bullet points, that probably wouldn't be sufficient either. So I took the decision to share you the priorities we've identified and the actions we're considering at the moment. Once the report is finalised, I think we should have it available certainly by the next Nutrient Management Board. And noting that you want to see it quite far in advance, it is quite a lengthy document. We split the document into separate parts. Now, all diffuse water pollution plans follow a standard template. But what we as we write them, and there's about 40 odd nationally, we make them bespoke to rivers. So they're not a copy and paste job. The nearest one here is the Clun, which is a smaller catchment and has similar issues, but also is different from the Wye because a lot of work has been happening in the Wye over the past decade or more. As part of the process of developing the plan, we did what we call an options appraisal. So that's what we got many of you in this room around a table trying to represent broadly people that have an interest or work in the catchment, whether that be your environmental charities, citizen science, statutory organisations, and so forth. So in terms of the structure of the table, we identified the key themes that came from that, and that's what you will see in Table A. And they're the sort of overarching priorities where we would look to focus some of the work. Now, I think many of you say, well, that's already happening. What the second part of the table looks at, not just what's happening at the moment, because there's a lot of stuff happening which is important, not just for nutrients, but also wider river health, but also some of the tools that are being developed. And some of those tools will be farming tools. So we have agreed with DEFRA to trial a planet nutrient loss tool. We're also working in the supply chain, looking at a tool which farmers can use to try and calculate, as a trial, calculate their phosphate reduction. So try and provide that glide path from where nutrients are now and perhaps where they need to get to. Now, there is also an element where further investigation is needed, particularly around sediment. We know sediment is a particular cause. As you'll also be aware, we've spoken previously about the main pressures actually being in the lug rather than the main body of the Wye itself. So a lot of the emphasis will be on that part of the catchment. There are synergies between this work and other work that's ongoing. We know that Welsh Water are meeting their obligations under AMP8. We know that there's a wider pressure within the river system in terms of the climatic and the work being delivered through the catchment partnership. So all of those we've taken into consideration. We are looking for things like higher tier stewardship and where we can apply that bespokely through Natural England. And Claire's team are looking at that now, but also the work that Kate and the Rural Hub are delivering in terms of the Wye-Escapes landscape recovery. And some of these things we can further model because the plan is iterative. So where we go next is we can, and we'll look at whether we can model the fact that Avara takes 75% of nutrients out of the catchment from their supply chain. So then we can start to look at the next sector apportionment, and also an element of some work we need to continue to do around farmer engagement, and also some of the tools farmers can use to support nutrient reductions, because we know that's where the predominant failures are coming from. And then the final part of the report, and I'll assume it is as read, there's some further work that we need to consider, particularly through some of the research parts. We're all aware of the DEFRA research, and I think last time I spoke about the gap. So what we'll have is we'll have existing measures and mechanisms, including the stuff through catchment sensitive farming, through current SFI, sustainable farm incentives, through regulation, which bring nutrients down to an extent. Now, they don't bring it down to close what we call the nutrient gap. So the gap between what those measures modelled will reduce to what the river target is. So we know that perhaps research would help trying to establish that through different farm trials and so forth. And all of that is still on the table. And DEFRA, I did check with them this morning, they will be looking to undertake some workshops around sort of the autumn time through a consultant to come and try and get the information from the catchment in terms of trying to define what that focus looks like. So that's where we are at the moment. I anticipate some questions. We have got a report that we're due to release, hopefully, I would say, sort of towards the end of August, which is the study we did with Lancaster University on legacy phosphate, surplus phosphate. We have been asked for it. It's currently being, it was delivered through our national team. That they're currently peer reviewing and ensuring that we can release it. And that's not to sanitize it. That's just because it was a document that was produced through a government body. And then from that, we then have to understand what that next bit looks like.
Thank you. Has anyone got any questions or comments? Louise?
Thank you. I thought it was really useful, actually, the summary of the strategic priorities and everything else. I really appreciate that. And you can't get the full report to us, so thank you for that. When you mentioned about the catchment sensitive farming, kind of techniques, methods, things that are available in that already that we know, kind of, even if they're all done by all farmers, we've still got the gap. Are we looking at including more things, more options into catchment sensitive farming, so that there are, you know, more things that farmers could be able to do, like much wider buffers or that, you know, much more habitat creation on courses and ditches on farms, things like that. Is that research or is that going in maybe?
So I'll pick that one up. Because Natural obviously delivered the catchment sensitive farming advice. So that's all part of the government's elm schemes. So we've got at the moment SFI is on hold. We're looking to develop that next year. We've got so what is new is the higher tier. We've got some new elements of what we call higher tier part of that. And the really pertinent ones around those are around kind of river restoration options, floodplain management options, which pay really quite significant money for land forgone and provide really significant change in terms of the impacts that it can have on restoring the whole natural function of the river. So you're not just looking beyond buffer strips. Buffer strips are brilliant, 3D riparian zones are brilliant, all those can be delivered through the SFI scheme, and that will open and the uptake will continue to be really positive. Higher tier agreements can deliver beyond that, actually reconnect the river to its natural floodplain. So that's another part of the scheme that delivers that we haven't had before. And all of our advice, including our catchment sensitive farm advice, they all deliver farm advice. Whoever's going out to a farm or engaging farmers to try and encourage them to think in that way, to think about the maximum outputs that they could possibly provide on their farm. And then they've got these tools to persuade them to do that. And we've done a lot of training around that with our advisors. They're working especially in places around the Arrow. You can imagine at the moment, I'm sure Georgie's on that, there's farmer engagement at the moment can be challenging in places. Our catchment sensitive farming advisors especially have really good and positive relationships with farmers, and we're trying to use those to ensure they understand. But it's a complicated world out there. They've also got BNG options to consider and beyond that. And then the other thing, which also Kate's here, we've got the landscape recovery scheme as well. So that's still a relatively new scheme, part of the government's environmental land management scheme. So those elements are additional to what we've had before that we will hopefully see benefits of. The scheme as a whole, it's owned by DEFRA, not owned by Natural England. We help deliver it, but DEFRA also constantly reviewing it and evaluating the effectiveness of it to where they might look at payments and target it. But we're just doing everything we can along with farmers on Herefordshire and lots of people around this room, really encouraging that uptake, significant uptake, some of those options.
It's still the same voluntary.
It's all voluntary, yes. Yeah, that element of the it's just one aspect of many things we need to consider, but that's all voluntary, so it's incentivized by payments. Yeah.
Now, one of the things, surely the nutrient management plan, which we agreed to let lie while we did the DWPP, the reason it would have failed the Dutch nitrate test because it was voluntary, unevidenced and uncertain. So I don't know how a suite of voluntary incentives, which are fiscal and also temporarily, kind of they're year-long payments, they're not decades, apart from landscape recovery. I don't know how that would then make the DWP client alternative to the nutrient management plan that we were asked to stand down from.
That element of it is always voluntary and it can't form part of certainty in the language of nutrient neutrality any more in the DWP than it could in a nutrient.
So where does our certainty and our mandatory element of a plan making come from, Claire? Where's the, if we were to go before the kind of thoughts of Dutch nitrate case, where would we say here's our certainty, our accountability, our deliverability, all those factors that failed in 2018, where would we demonstrate those?
So that's what we've had this conversation a number of times where it's not going to be, can't be provided through this. So that comes through the mitigating strategy, through Herefordshire Council, that certainty for development in housing.
No, I'm talking about the plan. So to make a catchment recovery plan, where's your certainty and your deliverability, your accountability for making a compliant legal plan against the European tests?
The European tests for what though?
For the reason that Dutch nitrate said that plans that were put forward for catchment recovery were not reliable. That test still exists, doesn't it? You still have to make a plan.
This test, the DWPP plan, doesn't have to conform to that in the way.
No, but we were asked to not revise the nutrient management plan. Instead, we're going to do a DWPP.
Well, the DWPP will, as my understanding, form the data and evidence base of the English part of the nutrient management plan. The Welsh part is being commissioned now, and they will come together. And only at the point at which they come together do they become a nutrient management plan.
And that's for Herefordshire Council, yes. And then it's for Herefordshire Council to use that plan in terms of your mitigation strategy.
The question that you raised about how can you use a plan that has voluntary measures as mitigation for a local plan is
you can't.
You can't.
You can't.
So that's why we would need other strategic mitigation.
Absolutely, just like Alice was talking about. So the advice and the voluntary
don't have any form of mandatory control.
Strategic mitigation is not catchment recovery.
Right.
So we can't perpetuate the point where you make people pay to do something while your catchment ecologically suffers and then eventually, I presume, collapses. I don't know. We've had all these things about the crayfish, biosolids, the biocides, all in 1 month, and yet mitigation will not address any of those things. So that can't be a strategic tool to catchment recovery.
But
I don't know why we're not looking at what actions do we need to do to put the catchment in favourable conditions. Mandatory actions that aren't based on financial benefits and they're not kind of 3 to 5 years. They're things that you do forever because they.
But there isn't an existing instrument for mandatory actions as I observe it. I think an instrument, it would have to be a water protection zone, wouldn't it?
So in terms of the nutrient management plan, well, what we have a chat with Herefordshire Council and to talk about where does the nutrient management plan sit in its new form, if you like. Now, what we end up with, and we've spoken about this, many groups, we have too many plans which are trying to deliver either the same thing or they just duplicate. So what our proposal is as Councillor Swinglehurst has said, that the two plans, the Welsh evidence, the English evidence, come together. We'll look at how perhaps you can do some form of cross-pollination of the two, of some executive summary type thing, or holistic or catchment-specific recommendations. If you look at the previous, the phosphate action plan, the certainty in that plan is less certain than we've got now, because a lot has happened since that original plan was developed in terms of the Lancaster research, the monitoring that we've done, and our knowledge has advanced significantly. So what we've got with the DWPP is an update and consolidation, not only of what's happened in the past, but also what that future direction is. Now, in terms of, we talk about voluntary measures, it's a suite of different actions. There's regulatory, there's voluntary, there'll be more incentive type measures, but there'll also be more education type measures. So where we get to is it's not one that fits all, and this is where it's a collaborative process, because regulation will achieve something, voluntary measures will achieve something, education will achieve something, as well as some of the larger landscape scale changes. Where I think that we need to understand a bit more is that some of these measures, particularly when you look at diffuse water pollution, so we can measure a contribution, for example, from marsh water, it comes out of the pipe. It's not so easy for, as we know, from a diffuse source. The difficulty is we hear coming from Lancaster that legacy phosphate overapplied, I think, since 1875. So we need to understand a bit more around legacy phosphate and what that means, because you won't necessarily see a change in the river target or the condition for time, depending on where you are in the catchment. So that's where we have a greater certainty than we've got before, but we're going to struggle at this point in time, pending further research, to be able to say that will deliver that. And that's not unique to the Wye. That's many catchments where you've got exactly the same issue, and many catchments suffer from a mix of industry, from water industry, as well as agriculture in terms of pollution sources. So it is not unique. And I'm speaking to some colleagues who, you know, they've got similar challenges in Cumbria, where you've got, you know, predominantly rural catchment, you've got a target you need to meet and a gap. So they're evolving similar to us. I think the Wye is much further advanced because of the work and the focus that's happened in this catchment, including regulatory, compared to perhaps some of the other catchments that we're responsible for.
I've looked carefully at the DWPP as it stands now, which I accept is not a full document. My overall comment is if we keep doing the same things, even with slight adjustments, we're going to get the same results. I don't see any radical changes here. And I hear what you're saying about all these incentives that are now going into the farming industry. I've never yet met a farmer, and perhaps Kate can actually verify this, who's going, whoopee, all our problems are solved, we've got all the right incentives. Because I don't think they feel that at this time. I was with a farmer last week who spent 50 years on his farm. Well, short-term applications for 1 year or 2 year are not solving his problems long-term for the viability of the farm and his family. So I would like to see more applications of actions that can deliver something rather than we hope will deliver something. And I'm not keen on constantly saying they're voluntary. I'm probably with the voice of the river that says there should be some mandatory things. And if that requires change to everything that we have here, I think we need to acknowledge that and lobby for that change rather than just accept that we'll be here in a year's time. And I'm sure, Claire, nothing against you, you'll be telling me you're still doing voluntary work and you're still doing all the voluntary things. If it's not achieving the change that is required, I'm not saying it doesn't achieve change, but sufficient change that's required, we are not fulfilling our mandate of how do we get the river back into good ecological state. And as I said, perhaps Kate will comment later on, I've never met a farmer that thinks they've got all the money now that they need through all the different incentives. I think constantly they're saying the applications are quite difficult. Have I got the skills to actually do it? Have I got the time to actually do it? So I think we do need revolutionary change, not incremental, hopeful change.
So
sorry. No, I'll just come back. Yeah, on a couple of points. Really recognise exactly what you're saying and absolutely recognise we've still got that gap, but open and honest about that gap. And we're all frustrated and don't want there to be a gap. In terms of the delivery schemes, the new higher tier landscape recovery are 10 and 20 year commitments to farmers. So they are different and they are long term. I'm not saying for 1 minute that that's going to close the gap. It's not, but it is change in that voluntary area. But there is still a huge amount of work to do. And just to obviously understand from a statutory government's point of view, we can't lobby. So we're here, part of the collaborative. Absolutely, you can.
And my comment on
just to recognise
the schemes is there certainty that they will be open for a length of time, or are they, as is often said, got a cap on the amounts because they may close again in a year's time or even sooner. And I think that's the uncertainty. But I have great sympathy with the farming industry.
Yeah, it's a very, it is, there is uncertainty out there which doesn't help that uptake, and which we do make obviously feedback to DEFRA very
So
clearly.
just to go back to the DWPP and how that might become an interim. If we have in the context of what we have today, the gap identified, so we know there's a gap, will the plan postulate the way in which that gap will be breached, or will it just simply go, well, there's a gap and we don't know quite what we're going to do about that? Because a plan is either, you know, a bunch of stuff that you can do, or it's the things that need to be done to achieve the outcome, the desired outcome. This is our plan. We are here, we need to get there, and this is our plan to do it. At the moment, it feels like it's a plan that goes, we are here, we need to get there, we can get about here, and then we're not really certain what happens next. What will it be?
Well, then that's a really good evaluation, because as you just described, when you've got catchments where your predominant source is a point source, so through a pipe, and you can upgrade through, you know, phosphate, we know therefore it's measurable. Yeah, so what we rely on is what we talk about modelled reduction, so different farming scenarios and what that equates to. Now, what we've modelled so far will only achieve so much, so we still have the gap. So therefore, we need to identify what does close the gap, and one of the mechanisms to do that would be through research.
Well, you have, as it were, a theoretical with the work at Lancaster. So they came up with a plan that said, if you did this, this, and this, the result will be what you're looking for. The things that they suggest are not things that you're comfortable putting in the plan. I get that, but what does need to be in the plan, or does the plan just going to sort of not really get to where it needs to get to? It's simply going to be a statement of the gap. And I think that's going to be problematic. We what's the point of having a plan that simply identifies what we all know, which is that we haven't currently got a suite of actions, either regulatory or voluntary or whatever, that can produce the outcome that we're looking for. And I do think it's really important sort of to give full and due acknowledgement to the landscape recovery schemes, because they are the best hope of a joined up strategic and sort of effective set of suite of voluntary interventions. So that's the best use of voluntary, because it's joined up. Otherwise, you just end up with a slightly bonkers way where somebody might be hired here, but their neighbour isn't and the other neighbour isn't. And how do you have like a 3-field floodplain when the fields either side that aren't? How's that going to work? It doesn't make sense. Whereas the more strategic use through landscape recovery does make sense, or makes more sense anyway. But I don't know quite how we're proposing to get to the gap in this iteration of the plan, because at the moment I'm not getting any sense of that at all.
No, and that's the same challenge we have. Our national team are aware of the gap and some of the measure mechanisms that we perhaps need to investigate further. So the diffuse water pollution plans, I think most of them will be signed off by March 26. We will then understand what that next bit looks like, including actually, we spoke previously, some of these measures aren't funded. So what does that look like in terms of enabling delivery of some of those measures? If we talk about sediment fingerprint and landscape recovery wise, we can model what intervention landscape recovery is proposing and what that looks like. But again, because you've got a stringent target and you've got a significant nutrient reduction that's required, it makes it much more challenging in terms of what does that closing the gap looks like, and that's what we need to work on next.
Yeah,
and whether that's
sediment fingerprinting work, which sounds really interesting, you know, and I think we're all vaguely suspicious that sediment within the river is a source potentially of nutrient, obviously, but you know, fingerprinting it isn't going to stop it flying in off the field. So you have to kind of you know, upstream everything. What are you going to do? If you go, yes, there's a load of stuff coming out of the sediment in the river. What are you going to do about that?
So there's different ways we can do that. So the government announced additional funding for agricultural regulation in the last 2 weeks. So that gives us more resource. We expect that to come by 1st of April 2026. We already spend, I would say, probably touching 50% of our regulatory resource already in this catchment. We're also doing some further remote sensing work where you can start to, like we've done before, where you can start to look at where that landscape scale intervention is needed, because we've got the drones and the satellite survey. So all of that stuff needs to be worked through before we understand what the next bit looks like, including greater regulatory compliance.
And then Christine. And then Liz.
Thank you. I want to focus on table A, which is entitled Strategic Priorities, identified through the diffuse DWPP options appraisal process. Number 5, supply chain engagement and accountability. So as we've just heard from you, Martin, diffuse pollution is from farms. It's also a little bit from septic tanks, and there's also a component from road runoff. But things like Welsh water, in this instance, pretty blameless. I'm very curious to know where you mention embedding environmental standards and incentives and support into supply chains. What do those incentives look like? What are those environmental standards going to be that will enable Avara to reduce their waterborne and airborne emissions from their operations? Because at the moment, all we've got from Avara, thanks to volunteers like myself putting pressure on them, is that they've now transferred the problem away from spreading extra phosphorus onto the fields in this catchment. They've now transferred that problem onto the roads in this catchment by driving their heavy lorries over them, damaging them, giving them potholes to take all the manure that arises to another catchment where it's disposed of there instead. And in the process of doing that, you've got airborne emissions from the exhaust gases from the lorries. You've got road tyre wear and brake wear emissions from the lorries. You've got damage to the roads, which, by the way, the local taxpayer, such as me, picks up the tab for. And you've got airborne emissions in the form of a plume of ammonium gases that gas off the manure pile until it's removed from one catchment to another. So basically, the word that's missing out of this entire strategic plan, as far as I can tell, is the word destocking. Because as the Refocus report was quite clear, the only viable way of seriously denting the amount of excess nutrient put onto the land is through a reduction in livestock manure production.
So in terms of the first part of your question, and I can't speak for Avara, but Avara have responded to what the catchment were asking for, which is what they committed to do through the sustainability roadmap, was export their manure out the catchment. The consequences of that has been, as you described. So you export manure, therefore you've got more transport. Consequently, in terms of where that's going, through the work that we do in terms of the assurance, we have been and are looking at where those manures do go to, because the worst thing that would happen is you took those manures out of the catchment and you just move the problem along. When you look at livestock numbers, in terms of, there's a lot, and Alison's here today, done a lot of work on livestock numbers too. Really, what we're looking at is where manures are going, because what's important is the end use of those manures rather than just numbers. Which is why you see, if we look at Avara and we say that, or they say 75% of their manures are exported, those manures are no longer applied in catchment, or they're only applied where they need. So therefore we can say, well, what is the next sector? In terms of, this plan doesn't look at ammonia emissions in terms of your airborne emissions, where you've got a permitted poultry unit that has specific conditions on aerial emissions, but this doesn't go into airborne emissions, and perhaps you're talking about sort of the deposition element to it.
Yeah, I mean, when it rains, those airborne emissions become soluble and are put back on the ground. And I'm genuinely curious to know, what are these environmental standards and incentives that will allow Avara to sustain from unsustainable poultry production, which is presumably what they currently do, because they've written a roadmap which says that they're going towards sustainable poultry production, and into that halcyon future of sustainable so-called poultry production.
I think what you'll start to see is and we've seen it already, is the advance in technological solutions. We've spoken to a lot of people who approached us around how do you make manures more manageable in terms of pelletising. We've even seen when manures are exported from the catchment, we've been to some farms and they're importing manufactured fertiliser to replace one with the other. Again, so it's not as simple as you would hope in that way. So the technological advances, I think, will certainly be focusing on what does storage look like in terms of manures. So particularly, how do you store them more sustainably? How do you transport them more sustainably? And what is the process of doing that? And that's what they're exploring at the moment. But I can't speak on behalf of them because I don't specifically sit on that group.
So I have not really had an answer to this number 5 on the overarching strategic priorities of dealing with supply chain engagement and accountability. I'm not particularly encouraged, if I'm honest. Nothing's going to change, is it, Martin?
Well, I think a lot's changed already.
Yeah, I think we're going to leave that there because other people want to come in. Thanks, Tom. Christine and then James.
Hello. Alyssa partly dealt with what I was going to say. I was focusing on the bit on page 8, I think it is, about under action measures, about looking at bare soil. And I think citizen scientists think that this is incredibly important. One of the problems is these are called action stroke measures, which is what we've been talking about, really, the difference between the two. But I wonder if the agencies have thought of any way in which looking at bare soil and somehow getting people's observations to track soil loss into rivers can be utilised. This is particularly important to me because all headwater where I live turns into oxtail soup several times a year. Turbidity, well, you can't see your little target when you've put about 2 millimetres water in your tube.
So I don't mind me saying, Andrew. So Andrew, you were working, weren't you, on this mud spotter process in terms of identifying areas where soil losses are occurring. Now, one of my colleagues who does a lot of the drone work where we can look at that spatial understanding of farming practice, his comment last week, actually, we received very few reports of soil loss incidents. I think perhaps because probably they're common and people don't really see them as a pollution in the same way you perhaps would sewage or oil or something like that. Now, what we have got, and we do chat with the Citizen Science group now once a quarter, which I know, Andrew, you sit on that group as well, is we've got a new instant reporting online platform now. So before you used to have to ring up every time. So what we would look hopefully to do is sort of bridge the mud spotter process and get that into our, incident recording process. So therefore you start to get a better picture into what's occurring, but also once it's on our systems, it's then triaged and therefore is recognised as an issue rather than it being on a separate platform. And we spoke about what 3 words and images, because then I think what we'll then do is we'll start to increase the amount of reports we're getting, hopefully over this winter if we see similar patterns to previous years.
I think there's a whole bit of very useful work joining up with the local authority.
Yes, and I did speak to Steve before about soil loss to roads. And I know in some catchments they've used a similar joining up, and that's someone we can, I'll chase that one up.
Can I just add to what?
Can I just ask if the Environment Agency and possibly also NRW would be prepared to prepare some sort of document about their thinking about soil loss, how it can be investigated and what might be done about it? Because the trouble is, you know, citizen scientists are sort of not in the picture of what is happening in the agencies which are hopefully using some of our data. It would be really helpful to actually have these discussions up front with the agencies.
Can I just
and sort of, you know, the intervals at which the discussions are offered and the amount of time to discuss the different issues is not really sufficient.
Okay,
Can I just add, because I think that there is a misunderstanding here, and Martin's quite correct. We got an email. We raised this issue with a meeting with the Environment Agency, which friends of the River Wye, Pat Sterling and myself were very concerned about how we could implement mud spotter. One of the issues was it's, in its purest sense, is very, very difficult. And what we said was we think it's a viable option, but it needs to be simplified. And the EA came back to us just yesterday. And I think I haven't read the entire document, but what it will now give us is all citizen scientists the ability to simply take a photo, send it into the EA with a location or 3 words, and that will start to build a bank of where soil erosion is happening. It's the most simplistic system we wanted, and we've now got. So it's up to the citizen science to implement it.
We're straying a long way away from the actual agenda item, so I'm going to pull that in now and just hear from Louise, and then we're going to pull an end to this item.
It just seems to me that we've got, you know, great colleagues in the EA and NRW, in Natural England, working really hard. Clearly they care. Clearly they're really frustrated by the system that they're working inside. And it feels like the legislative framework that we've got to operate within is just not sufficient. Obviously, that's talking about national government law changes, which don't happen immediately. Farming is exempt from the pollution legislation that tightly binds other industries. And it seems to me that's what's missing, a suite of legislation that it's not rocket science what needs to happen on farms. We all understand what the measures are that make a farm sustainable or unsustainable. This shouldn't be a choice that a farmer has. It impacts everybody in the country and every natural system. Sustainable farming should be our legally mandated norm. That would prevent all of this issue that we're all fighting within, because we don't have a suite of laws that make that a norm. We have this voluntary option, which is if we lobby towards that, get somewhere.
And we do have a general item 8, which will be looking at flying rules for water, which is the regulations that we do have. But before then, I'm to ask Ben Boswell for an update on the Welsh evidence, which will be travelling alongside the DWPP merging of it to become a nutrient management plan. Ben.
Thank you. So there's 2 aspects to this. The first one being the work that's underway with Ricardo. So that's the Welsh Government funded police looking at the management plan and the evidence base. So that where it's making good progress at the moment. We'll have a first draft of that a week, 2 weeks tomorrow, which point I can share that for sort of stakeholder comments. We then develop that for final reports for the first September. So I'll be able to share that with you in a couple of weeks' time. The second part of that then is the Wye Catchment management plan that came together. So conversations with colleagues at Welsh Government finalised funding off that. We've done the specification in work with the partners, thank you to everyone that's contributed to that, with Wye Catchment management plan. We'll be looking to commission that very, very shortly, taking that tomorrow in terms of finalising the specification, and then that will then run probably 6 to 9 months worth of work there. That will then be pulling together the evidence base, the options, appraisal actions, and engagement plans for all that together. So a little premature for this meeting, and it's going to be in 2 weeks' time off the draft, but we will circulate that comment.
and I'll keep everyone updated on the Wye Catchment Management Plan as that then gets commissioned and goes.
And that will form our kind of overarching plan, then the nutrient management plan, the yolk and the egg, jam and the donut, whatever food analogy you care to pick. But we look forward to seeing that Welsh evidence come forward, and we'll have a chance to sit input, and that'd be really great. Thank you. Got any questions on that? That's noted. Agenda item 8, back to Martin, sorry. The update on final rules for water guidance. So there have been some changes, I think, to the guidance, which I remember us having this discussion a while back about final rules for water. Says guidance led, so guidance is very important to how the EA interprets and enacts and responds to final rules for water. So in what way has the guidance changed, and what is the likely impact on the work you do?
So the final rules of water, so the legislation that sits behind it has not changed. When the final rules of water was first published, there was a separate Secretary of State's guidance which effectively gave us direction of how to apply the regulations. Now, part of that guidance had content within it which essentially told the Environment Agency that we should not seek to enforce. Now, the Final Rules of Water Secretary of State's guidance still exists, but it has been updated, reviewed, and the sentence which refers to the not to enforce has now been removed. Now, in terms of the sort of direction we're going in, the government are still supportive of an advising guidance-led approach to regulation, and that's often the first stage of enforcement. Look, it's fair to say we have got some cases going on in the catchment at the moment. We just aren't able to talk about them publicly because of legal privilege. But consequently, where we look at some of the key issues in terms of some of the farming practice at the moment would be ensuring obviously nutrients are applied at the right time, so particularly in the autumn, so the over winter period, whether that's appropriate or whether it should be into the spring where you've got greater economic need, and that's the sort of work that our officers look at the moment. We do know that through, if you recall, we've got a project called Project Tara, testing approaches to regulating agriculture. We're working on a report now, which we should be able to share, I would say, probably again around September time, alongside with the findings of that with Farm Herefordshire, because it's given us some interest in perhaps understanding of the regs. There's still some lack of awareness. But essentially, the way we regulate will stay the same. What changes is the direction within that guidance. So we're still looking at good agronomic need, soil practices, etc. And that's why where we get reports of soil loss, which would demonstrate poor farming practice, or what we call, reasonable precautions aren't being met and reasonable precautions are still subjective, that we can then work to try and address those. So for example, we have, if I use an example, we had an arable farmer was planting right up to the river edge, lost the crop, the top of the crop wilted, so you end up with a bare field, and consequently summer storm, all that soil gets washed in. So you could say actually that's not a reasonable precaution, because you should have actually considered the angle of the slope, the location of where you sow those crops in terms of your farming practice. So what we start through that process is we provide the advice, the guidance. It's all in writing, and sometimes we'll start the first stage, which would be a warning letter. So that's your first mark. There are some sites we are looking at the moment in terms of where we've taken action before. So we'll go back, review to see whether those practices have improved. And that's the process we're working through now. So the regulations haven't changed. It's just the direction within that Secretary of State's guidance that has been updated.
No other questions?
Can I just ask, Martin, I don't know if it's a typo. Principal changes, item 1. That doesn't read to make sense to me. No longer ask the agency not to enforce if land managers work within the terms of the
Yeah,
government.
so it's a double negative, isn't it? I did spot that.
So
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say.
Yeah. So essentially, what it's saying is that we're no longer directed to not enforce.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
got nothing to do with the managers work within the terms because we expect them to, and if they're
Yeah,
outside.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I did spot that after. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
secondly, there's no mention at all in this document of phosphate or phosphorus. Is that deliberate?
Because it's looking at nutrients.
Well, no, it mentions nitrate
Yeah. Okay.
pollution, but no mention of nutrient pollution. It just said nitrate.
Yeah.
Again, is that a typo that you've got it wrong for nutrient?
Nutrients.
Yeah. So you said I can't remember what it said. Is it nitrogen? It said. Is that because maybe nitrogen's really available?
You talk about nitrate pollution, not nutrient pollution in this document, and there's no mention of phosphate as a result. So I'm just wondering if that's a typo, and it should be.
Leave that one with me. I didn't write it. Our national team wrote it. I suspect it's because phosphates are normally locked within soils compared to nitrogen, which is more freely available. But I will check.
The one that the guidance 2.2 that I always found problematic, in a nutshell, saying is if you're applying a manure that where nitrogen and phosphate are combined and it's not reasonably practical to separate them, as long as you're applying to your nitrogen limit, that's fine. If you consequently over apply phosphate, that's also fine, and that's changed in this guidance.
So what we
So you have now a separate phosphate as well. So you have to be within both limits.
No, so what we're talking about is good agronomic practice. So we're talking about what nutrients do the crop need, and when those crops and when is that nutrient applied. So we do see some nutrients applied at wrong
But
time.
if you're applying nutrient in the form of a manure where N and P are combined, but the proportions of N to P mean that to apply the correct amount of N, you're over applying P. What limit are you setting?
I'll have to take them away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that was the effective 2.2. Was that the proportionality within, if it's not reasonable to separate?
Yeah.
Yeah, just for information, really. River Action obviously see this as an improvement. I think some of this came out of the legal challenge. We are seeking clarification over a couple of points through a reaction letter, and I think there should be news on that within the next day or two.
Okay, thank you. We'd be interested to know as that comes through. Thank you very much. Has anyone got any further comments on this? No? Okay, right, thank you. So we'll move on. Thanks, Martin. I think you're a hot seat now.
No, I'll take that away. I'll take that one away. In terms of the question.
Thank you. So, okay, now we have an update from Alison Cappin on the High Court judgment versus Shropshire Council. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks for inviting me to do an update. Yeah, for anyone who's not familiar with this legal case, this judicial review is that River Action and I took. It's a case in North Shropshire, place called Felton Butler, northwest of Shrewsbury, in between the A5 and the River Severn. And it was a particular case where we felt this is Shropshire Council gave permission for an intensive poultry unit for 200,000 birds. It was within less than 400 metres of an existing poultry unit with nearly 500,000 birds in, and we just felt that this was particularly poor processes that had been followed during the planning application process. So we took it to judicial review. That happened in early May, and we got the results, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And the judge has quashed planning permission, and effectively we have created some new case law from that. The two grounds on which we particularly which were approved were the digestate. The fact that the council approved that if manure goes to an anaerobic digester, they felt that was the end of the matter, and they were not following up where the digestate then goes once it comes out, because of course, I think as you all know, there's exactly the same amount of nutrients in the digestate as there was in the raw manure. And so we've closed that loophole, which now in future planning applications will need to address what happens to processed manure as well as raw manure. And the other one was that they had not effectively assessed all the cumulative impacts from that, the increasing numbers and accumulation of intensive poultry units that is happening across Shropshire, very much the same as you've seen across the Wye. We lost on the grounds around, well, the most significant one being the ammonia threshold, that Natural England have this 1% threshold for ammonia. Now, this was criticised, the judge criticised this quite several times during the proceedings. It's a 1% threshold, which he said, but you could have 1%, 1%, 1%, 1%, and you know, suddenly that adds up increasingly. And there are other scientific organisations that are saying that threshold should be lower. But our case couldn't resolve that. That will take a more direct legal challenge against the Natural England guidance on that. And discussions are ongoing with organisations like the Woodland Trust, Plant Life, River Action, as to whether to take that more direct legal challenge forward. But the point I just suppose I want to make, and picking up, I think it was Christine's question earlier, you know, that this is relevant for any live applications anywhere in the country. We still have about 8 live applications for more, you know, increasing volume of poultry. In Shropshire and Telford, there are about 8 applications. In Herefordshire, there's about 6 applications for another 250,000 birds, and 10 or 12 in Powys with at least 750,000 birds. So there are new case laws. Our case, there's the NFU versus Herefordshire case law. There's the Finch case, which was applied to intensive livestock units as well recently. So there is a sort of tightening up of these loopholes, but there are still a number of applications going through the system. And perhaps just if I could just finally add one point, which was that River Action is currently engaging with lots of stakeholders and in discussion with government about whether there should be more of an agricultural water pollution strategy. And we have drawn up some guidelines on what that might look like and how it could work. And I thought the board would be interested to monitor the progress of that over the next few months.
Indeed. Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. Has anyone got any questions or comments about Alison? Okay, in which case, I'll just thank you very, very much for that update. It's extremely interesting. And I think, as you note correctly, this is part of a number of things that have happened which seem to indicate a direction of travel. But it's certainly very, very, very interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, so next item on the agenda, if Martin Williams is still on the call. Martin, are you with us? Martin Williams.
In spirit.
Hey, there he is.
Hello.
How are you?
Oh yeah, I'm with you in spirit. I'm very good, but I must start by saying I don't think I've ever sat through such a woe is me meeting. I felt quite depressed having sat here for 2 hours waiting for my slot. I think there's an element of God, it just seems impossible to listen to. I agree with Martin Quine on some of the points, and I think we need to start looking at the future of the river, not the bloody past. It's just annoying. I don't know which date you'd like to go back to within this group, but if you went back to the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, you'd probably find it was worse. So let's just look for the future rather than be this dismissive group of people hanging their heads in shame over their shoulders. As
So what
if
happened
it's
to the ministers, Martin?
Sorry?
What happened with the ministers?
It's quite frankly embarrassing, and I wouldn't want to have to sit through this meeting in a grown-up room. It's quite sad. So let's get that out of the way, because I've sat here for 2 hours, so I'm going to say my piece. I've been very lucky to be invited onto the DEFRA Regulations Committee, which is going to meet over the next few months up until October in phase 1 of a look at regulation. It has an open-ended, and there are many stakeholders around the table: Natural England, of course, EA, CLA, NFU, River Action, etc. It is in its very early infancy. It's over 3 phases. The first phase is this initial bit from now until October. The next phase will follow on from that and take the findings of that through the winter into next year. So I wouldn't get too excited about something new coming out. I wouldn't get something happening this side of Christmas, but something is happening. And it seems the ministers are determined to address the issues in front of us. Regulation, as Martin says, will only do so much. And that has been made perfectly clear in the initial 2 meetings with government. Regulation will only do so much. So sitting around the table here, berating the lack of regulation and we should be regulated off the land is quite honestly astonishing, and it's very short-sighted. But if you want any more updates on it as we go, then that's right. But the door is open for any style of regulatory change. It's not limited to or held back by any sort of agenda. It's an open-ended discussion. We've had 2 meetings so far, and they'll continue until October in that first phase. There we go. I've said my piece.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. Has anyone got any questions for Martin? I know it's a bit sorry, Martin, it has been quite difficult to hear you sort of faded in and out a bit. I think we got the gist.
Sorry, I'm hauling corn off a combine today.
Yeah. Not worried, no to worry about that. No, that's it. Okay, thanks very much, Martin. Right, okay, good. Question, Martin. Okay, so Kate, could you give us an update on the nutrient balances work that you're doing?
Yeah, I understand there's some slides queued up.
Yay.
Okay, I've put lots of text on these because I appreciate they might want to be circulated around after. But we've been working on a nutrient balance pilot supported by the Environment Agency through our Soils, Nutrients and Compliance project, really trying to pick up the mantle from the source apportionment data, which identifies agriculture as the single greatest source of nutrient load to the river, and also from Lancaster's recommendations in terms of nutrient load and undertaking farm gate balances. We really recognise that actually data sets in farming are quite hard to come by. They're available through DEFRA census data, which is then immediately out of date and not updated very often, or best available figures through sort of RB 209 recommendations and other fertiliser manuals like that. But what we did see is the opportunity to try and create a local data set, which helps to try and capture where we are now. My personal opinion is that the refocus work is probably showing where we were a couple of years ago. The revisions that they discussed with us at the beginning of the year around reducing excess as a result of inputting poultry data from the companies does show that progress can be made against that excess value, and we're really keen to try and capture that as much as possible for the other sectors and the farmers on the ground. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a locally led initiative enabled through our partnership work with the Environment Agency. We've initially done just over 60 holdings since last September, which covered about 14,000 hectares of the Herefordshire Wye. That is only a small area. We recognise that, so we're looking to try and expand that this year. But it was encompassing a range of farm sizes, enterprise types. The only sector we haven't done, I think, is pig and free-range poultry. We're looking to try and address that for the expansion. Okay, next slide. We've used the existing Planet Farmgate tool. It's quite old and it's currently being updated by the DEFRA team, and we're part of that consultation process. But it's very simple in terms of quantifying nutrient onto farm, fertiliser, manure, feed, bedding, all sorts of stuff are inputted, and then any exports, so manure exports, livestock sales, crops and product, to give you a balance of total nutrient load and then load per hectare for that holding based on its size. Okay, next slide. This is an example of one of the farms. Garnston Farms is the HDB monitor farm. They undertook that balance initially as part of the Herefordshire Agri Group, who really did pilot the pilot. So their first calculation was in 2022, where they were 33,000 kilograms of phosphate in excess. As a result of that, they've made significant changes to their business, changing from a particular beef finishing enterprise into something slightly different. That's meant that when they updated their balance in 2024 as part of this pilot, they're now in a minus figure of 33,000. So it is capturing what changes happen on farm and the impact that has on their nutrient load. So we felt like that's a great starting point and can show hopefully what can be done. Okay, next slide. So what does that look like across that pilot, across the 14,000 hectares? We've got green being nitrogen imports and blue being phosphate imports. You can see lots of different types of key sources. So you've got nitrogen fertiliser, manures being imported, bedding matter, forage, concentrate and compounds both relate to livestock feed. So you can see there that nitrogen and phosphate is predominantly coming onto farm in livestock feed. So that confirms the Lancaster recommendation and findings. In terms of phosphate, fertiliser is very small on those farms. I think it's capturing a real life scenario now rather than what is assumed is being applied through RB209. But nitrogen is something that has obviously still been quite high in fert and in feed. Okay, next slide will then show us that in a different format, but again emphasising that the majority of nitrogen imports is through compound feed and then significant amounts in fertiliser. Okay, next slide. Likewise with the phosphate, majority compound feed, but some being manure being brought onto farm as well, but less of a concern around fertiliser, probably driven by reduced application, precision application, and cost of fertiliser is a big drive there. Okay, next slide. We then look at exports. The majority of manure exports is taking the phosphate and nitrogen away. A lot of the nitrogen being exported is through harvested crops and then the livestock themselves when they're being sold finished livestock product. But hopefully you can see how that balances. Next slide, please. The refocus work currently calculated as 6.2 kilograms of phosphate per hectare excess. Across those pilot farms, the average was minus 14 kilograms of phosphate per hectare, so a significant change to what refocus has been indicating, but it did also indicate a nearly 100 kilograms of N per hectare excess still exists, so still plenty of work to be done. I've put the imports and exports side by side there so you can see them slightly more meaningfully than in those pie charts, but yeah, hopefully we're getting there in terms of phosphate, and it's sharpening our senses in terms of making sure that nitrogen is the same. You can see on the box and whisker chart on the left hand side, the majority of those holdings were in that category, and there are some high flyers and low flyers which show on the top end and bottom end of those box and whiskers. There are some holdings that are still very high in excess and some holdings that are also now very low. So there is still a good range of practice of nutrient load on farms. There's still plenty of work to be done there. Okay, next slide. We've done a lot of evaluation of this nutrient balance pilot as part of our project for Wye Snack, trying to get those who participated to give us some feedback to help us plan what we do with this information to support them going forwards. A lot of them were driven mostly by the fact that they wanted to be involved in a locally led, farmer-owned data set to try and capture the improvements that they do make, but also very much by wanting to improve this understanding of nutrient load on farm, because they're quite unsettled by the thought that they may be compliant with NVZ and farming rules for water, but in fact actually still have a nutrient excess. So it's closing a gap that exists between those existing regulatory pieces of frameworks. We've also highlighted there some of the challenges that they think they face. So understanding and interpreting soil and manure data, still very reliant on an external agronomist for them to do that. And also thinking about whether they can access legacy P. There's a low level of confidence that they can actually reduce application rates and utilise that legacy P level. So we're really keen to make sure that the DEFRA soil project can help improve our understanding of how and when we can access legacy P for crop growth, and therefore farmers feel more confident in reducing those P applications accordingly. Okay, next, and I think final slide. So again, some of the barriers that they felt there is still not enough clear practical guidance for them to access from their agronomists or independently to make those decisions. What else have we got there? A lot of concern around impact on profitability and productivity, especially given this year, reduction of BPS, closure of SFI, potentially failed harvests for a lot of people sat in combines in the next couple of weeks. They're worried about making another informed decision that could reduce their productivity. So they are likely to be continuing to apply nutrient up to legal levels to try and counteract any potential financial losses from crops. But overall, it's been a very positive pilot. We've now got confirmed funding with the Environment Agency to continue Wye Snack for the next financial year. We've also got some funding committed from external sources, including a major retailer that will be announced next week, to expand that to their supply chain, and looking to work with as many farm Herefordshire partners as possible who've committed to try and doing more nutrient balance work while they also have advisors on the farm. So Herefordshire Council are doing that with their carbon project. Catchment sensitive farming officers are looking to do it. Wye Foundation staff, Wildlife Trust staff, anytime they're on farm, will be doing these nutrient balances so that hopefully this data set continues to grow. And then the intention is that it can be shared with Lancaster University, who are primed for later in the year to try and look at that, ratify it, determine how statistically significant it is based on that final hectareage that it covers, and hopefully run it as a model through their next refocus programme. The end.
Thanks. I mean, for me, I just want to say, if you're going to get data, try to get good data, get quality data, and this is about improving the quality of the data. That's really quite important in understanding what's going on and so brilliant work. I'm hugely supportive of it. Andrew.
Hi, I'd just like to say thanks, Kate. That's probably the best presentation on farming in Herefordshire I've ever seen. Job very well done. Only one comment, could you expand it into soil health? Because that would be another really key thing for us to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our challenge is we've got to use the existing tools, and FarmGate is not perfect in Planet. Like I said, it's pretty old and horrible. You have to physically download the programme. It's not very up to date, which is great to hear that DEFRA are updating it. But we do feel like that kind of, okay, the nutrient load is this, but how does that relate to legacy and total P in the soil, and how do we access it, is a big knowledge gap. That's what these farmers are asking. So a lot of them, having done their P balance, are now going, okay, well, how do I test for total P? What can I do to reduce that? If I have an excess, will it keep building? How quickly can I reduce it? So there's lots of things that we need to do it's great to hear that DEFRA are hoping to invest in that. We'd love it to be quicker and get some answers sooner, but we appreciate that that's not likely. So yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. This is step one.
Really, really nice to see that and follow it. Thank you.
Tom.
Yeah, I echo what Andrew just said. I'm actually genuinely impressed. Thank you for making good effort there. I do want to raise one question, which is on the quality of the data. Martin Williams loves to needle us on the quality of our citizen science data, so I'm allowed to do it back. You mentioned, is it Planet?
Yeah.
So that is where you're getting your imported concentrate and feed data from,
So
not from a virus, hey?
No, so what we end up doing is, in this instance, all of those farms have been visited by one of my team, so a sort of independent advisor who sits with the farmer and they say, you know, how many livestock of this type of character have you got? What fertilizers did you bring on? What concentration of nutrients did that involve? Can I see your feed tickets so that we can input exactly the data that goes in? So it is being sort of independently ratified on farm. That's then run through the tool and they're given their result on the spot. We take that data away and put it into the master database, anonymised and collated. So it's being done as independently as possible and as accurately as possible based on feed tickets. And we've seen massive differences month to month where perhaps a particular feed was on sale, sort of gold blend, shall we call it, which had enormous quantities of phosphate in, probably above what those cattle may have needed, but it was the cheapest on offer at the time they needed feed. That farmer couldn't believe the nutrient load that brought onto his farm in comparison to the next year where he didn't use that. It was a different blend, which happened to be low in P. So we are trying to really get the detail of what feed was used, what was its composition, and put it into that Planet tool to get as accurate data out as possible. Because then the farmers can make informed decisions. It's not using standard data.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any more? Just very quickly to echo the brilliant piece of work, and I don't know if the team have been in touch yet or they are going to be to see how we can better support. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you've spoken to Judith.
Yes,
but
I've
yeah,
had some meetings with you. Yeah, thank you.
I was hoping to have something from Simon, but he's not feeling well, and I see he's not on the call either, so we'll skip along to the date of the next meeting.
Just to shameless plug before we do anything else. Just to update, Liz's last meeting with us in our phosphate mitigation lead role. That job is now live advert, so we're pressing that out. I just wanted to say, if you could please help us to publicise that, push out through the networks. It's obviously a really key role for us to mention as part of this board. So I circulate a link to that and really welcome any support in pushing that out there so we get really good pool candidates.
I wanted to give a brief update from the Citizen Science Fraternity on a new initiative called the Big Ranunculus Watch.
Yes, I've seen that on
Fantastic. Be great to just record it formally here. Ranunculus is, of course, the keystone species in the SAC citation, and it really forms the key habitat for everything else that lives in the river. So we've started this new Big Ranunculus Watch programme. Please share it with all your friends, colleagues, families, and anyone else who might not be interested. And let's keep looking to the future to see the habitat in the river recover and monitor that and prove to ourselves that life isn't all just doom and gloom like it might be on a combine.
Okay, fair enough. And will you be reporting the results of that as you know, they start to form into a picture of what's going on up the trips and elsewhere where you might be seeing ranunculus recovering?
I don't envisage any formal report for at least a year.
Yep.
But we certainly do hope to keep regular updates coming as the information amasses.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, you can't, it's people who are actually on the river and in the river will know what's going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, any more?
It's just worth adding to what Tom has said that Citizen Science, in conjunction with the EA and National Landscapes, are looking at whether or not we can survey a lot of the catchment via drone see where binoculars sits, where it doesn't. We're experimenting now with a view, if it works well, to having full rollout for next year.
Oh, that would be very fantastic. That would be really, really good. Because I think that the ability to see, you know, what's going on, particularly as far as I'm concerned, would be very, very useful for us to know the effectiveness of what's happening. So,
And that's something citizen science between Friends of the Wye and CPR.
brilliant. That's really good. No?
Well, I promised to tell everybody that there's a new river trust being set up in River Arrow. It's called RAT because it's the River Arrow Trust. No, sorry.
Yeah, the water rats.
So there's currently 2 coordinators who are residents of the Arrow with a passion for trying to do something positive, and they have recruited a board of trustees, which includes Andrew and myself, some farmers and some local councillors and other people who are equally passionate in trying to do something positive, celebratory, but also meaningful in terms of how we connect people to rivers. So I promised I would announce that we have that set up. First meeting on the 4th of August.
Okay, very much. Okay, brilliant. So the next meeting will be on Wednesday, the 22nd of October. And we please pause the live stream.